Jeffro from Two Hacks Garage. Well, you know what? It's that time of year where projects are, getting built, but in some cases, like mine, kind of at a standstill, waiting on a rotating assembly to get balanced and waiting for some parts to come in. And you know what, guys? It's winter time, so it's kind of your stir crazy type of year. So what do I do? Well, a lot of times, seeing I don't really watch TV, I do a whole lot of reading. You know what, guys? That can be a rabbit hole because I like my vintage drag racing. Yep, this is going to be a little bit of what I refer to as from the archives. I've got quite a few old vintage drag racing magazines, hot rod magazines, books, you name it. And I came across something that I was looking for a while. And it's something actually really cool. A couple items here. One of them I'm going to start off with. It's Arnie the Farmer Beswick. It's a book by Dean Fait. And Dean is actually a really, really, really awesome guy. I got to know him for a short amount of time when he did a lot of stuff at Cordova Dragway. That is the home track of Arnie the Farmer Beswick, and he's also a guy that used to help, and I think he still does, Arnie Beswick with a lot of stuff. Anyway, he put together probably one of the most comprehensive books on Arnie Beswick. He worked with him on it. Tons of great photos, stories, you name it in this book. I'm going to put a picture of this book at the end of this video so you can see it if you want to, get yourself a copy. If you're a vintage drag racing guy, especially if you're a Pontiac guy, anything sort of that, this is a book for you guys. It's absolutely really freaking awesome. Well, anyway, that's not the gist of this story. This is where I talk about a rabbit hole. So in this book, I happen to be thumbing through it and, going through it, and I get to a part, and this is pretty interesting. It's a chapter 4. It's called the AFX years. And why do I say that's kind of important? Well, we all know him for his Pontiacs and his wild AFX Pontiacs, but did you know that Arnie Beswick, for a short stint, actually drove a Mercury? Yep. Mercury, they were big in the high performance stuff for a while. In fact, in 1966, they were the first, if you want to call it flip top funny car. They were factory backed, 427 injected cammers, and they were pretty wild. However, in 1965, they had their AFX Comets, which were also 427 cammers, and they were extremely fast. People like Dino Don got them, Eddie Sharpman, all that fun jazz. But he actually did join the helm of the Mercury crew for a little bit. I know that sounds weird because we all think Arnie the Farmer, Beswick, and Pontiac. Those two names go hand in hand. But in 1965, he inked a deal with Mercury to race one of their AFX Comets. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to read you a couple pages of this. Now, this is a perspective from Dean and Arnie, kind of the words from themselves, and it's actually pretty neat. But the reason why I call this the rabbit hole, well, I was going through my magazines, and I actually found an issue of June 1965, Super Stock and Drag Illustrated, probably my favorite magazine back at the time, that has a special dual feature, Arnie Beswick's 1965 Comet and his blown GTO. It's when they're out in Bakersfield. It's Bakersfield Blast. Another really awesome, cool vintage find. Why is it a rabbit hole? Well, I just happened to remember I had some other Arnie Beswick articles, and this one's Drag Parts Illustrated. It has nothing to do with Mercury, but it's still cool. But I realized one thing I had was I actually have an original 1965 press information package from Mercury, Lincoln Mercury Division, 3000 Schaefer Road, Dearborn, Michigan. This is actually an Arnie Beswick Mercury press kit, if you want to call it. Pretty neat. And I'm going to show you at the end of this a little bit more of that. At the end of this video, you'll see page by page. There's some actually really neat stuff in there. But I know it's kind of like story time. I'm not sitting by your fireplace or smoking a pipe. Maybe I should in the next video. But this is from the archives. This is explaining in 1965 when Arnie Beswick actually drove for Mercury. This is chapter 4, the AFX years. It starts off by calling it a different aspect for 1965. We'll back up to the close of 1964 racing. It was at Detroit Dragway where Beswick was approached by Fran Hernandez with the Lincoln Mercury Division. Fran took him out to dinner to sweet talk him with driving one of the 4 single overhead cam Comets being built for the 1965 drag racing season. General Motors had been out of racing since its self-imposed ban on March of 1963. Most of Arnie's racing peers had already switched camps in 1964 to either Ford or Mopar. Because of that, Arnie ended up with Cotton Owens GMC car hauler, which is used in a lot of very famous photos with his Pontiacs. Difficulty with the Pontiacs. In Arnie's case, the Super Duty parts and pieces for his Pontiacs were getting harder and harder to find. The ring and pinion for the 4-speed transaxle, the grocery getter wagon, and Le Mans coupe were particularly non-existent. Even though almost everyone else who drove the year-old cars and gone to conventional rear axles, Arnie stuck with the factory drivetrain. Development of the blown injected mystery Tornado GTO was slower than Arnie wanted. He knew something was going to have to be done to keep up with the competition. Arnie and his Pontiacs had just gone through at least 3 or 4 years of the greatest and winningest years of his racing life. But Mercury's offer began to look more attractive by the day, and he made the decision to make the switch. However, it wasn't made without a plan B. The racing industry. Up until then, the racing associations would pretty much accept anything that the factory built, and they sure were the classes for the NHRA specialty cars. The exception, however, was the NHRA at the start of the 1965 with the advent of the altered wheelbase Mopars. Those are the AFX cars I've talked about a few times that had a crazy altered wheelbase, acid dipped, all that fun jazz. Most of the rest organizations welcomed whatever the factory put out with open arms because it drew fan in droves. Going to the track as an independent, Arnie never knew how they might classify the car or even if they would let him run. Even in the first sit-down, Arnie had a couple of conditions for Mercury. First and foremost on his mind was that if the parts and pieces weren't available to keep this very new and experimental single red cam engine running for every week of his racing commitments, Arnie would have the option of filling these dates with one of his Pontiac race cars. Another condition was that he didn't want to play second fiddle to any of Mercury's other drivers. Dyno Don Nichols had already switched over to Mercury early in 1964, and Arnie was worried that Don would get the preferential treatment. Hernandez assured Arnie that he would be treated as well as all the others who were receiving these specialized cars. Additionally, Fran told Arnie that he could indeed race the Pontiac if the Comet was in the shop. He was confident, perhaps overly so, that the 427 Cammer Ford engine would be fine and never have any issues. Hernandez did put a condition on Arnie. If the engine had problems, Arnie was not to repair it himself. He was to get the engine to Mercury, and the company would either replace it or repair it. The new car. Both parties were happy, although maybe a little bit leery with the arrangement. Regardless of any apprehension by either party, on February 1st, 1965, Arnie and the Lincoln Mercury division of Ford Motor Company signed a 6-page contract. Per that agreement, it said that Arnie Beswick gave them $50 down with the final payment of $2,950 to be made in November of that year. As Arnie remembered, he only gave them $1 upon signing. After the contract was signed, the car was to be picked up at Bill Strope's Enterprise shop in Southern California just before the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona. Arnie's car had been top-coated, changed from the original red to white, as were the others driven by Hayden Proffitt and George DeLorean. Only Nicholson's had the original red. Although Arnie had hopes of going up and racing at Irwindale a week before, it was not to be able to be done that, as he was waiting for them to finish the car. Finally, when Arnie picked up the potent Hemi Merc, it had already been lettered and factory-readied for track use. Further disappointment happened when, upon arrival at Pomona facility, the NHRA wasn't entirely happy with the car. There were some minuscule issues, and consequently, Arnie's first pass in the car was during actual elimination runs. Despite the negativity, there were many promotional pictures taken before and during the meet because the press loved the cars. Returning to Daytona. The Comet, along with Mystery Tornado and Le Mans Coupe, were loaded and headed straight for Arnie's favorite wintertime event, Daytona Speed Week. In 1965, it was held at the Spruce Creek Airport, 15 miles from Daytona Beach. This year's competition ended on February 13th, having started 7 days earlier. Once in Florida, after a few nights of running, Arnie started to feel more comfortable with the car. During the third night, in time runs, an intake valve decided to let go, and as Arnie mentioned in 2000, proceeded to change the original shape of the piston and the portion of the cylinder head. I take that as it was a catastrophic engine failure. Needless to say, that put a quick end to any racing Arnie could do with that Comet at Daytona. As it turned out, the car was out of action for that week. Luckily, and thanks to the loophole in his contract, the week-long competition was not a total loss because Arnie had the Pontiac with him and managed to win the Unlimited Class award for the event. Unfortunately, Ford determined that the cylinder head was not repairable and a whole new engine must be sent. Ford Motor Company didn't send it to Morrison, though, because Arnie was still down south. The new wheel was flown in from Detroit and arrived on February 20th. Still racing down south. Bill Connell was the track owner at US 19 Dragway in Albany, Georgia. He wrote a little story and told Drag News how he and Arnie worked all night installing the new engine at the local Lincoln Mercury dealership. Then, in front of the next day's record crowd, Arnie took first place at the event with a 10.88 elapsed time at 130 miles per hour. As Bill put it, man, it sure wasn't in vain, as Arnie only had to readjust the Hurst linkage and zip, first place. Incidentally, Arnie's GTO took second with the Farmer driving and was followed by a new local Hemi Plymouth in third. The next reported run, which was on March 14th. Arnie towed the car to Helena, Alabama, near Birmingham, to run at the track there. The Drag News article that headlined with Beswick wins with an 888 ET blast warned readers not to be shocked as the strip is only 1,020 feet long. According to the article, Arnie took straight with 901 and 888 elapsed times. The local fans who packed the stands that day were amazed at the factory hot rod Comet's performance, as none of them have ever seen a Hemi-powered Ford product before. Politics of corporate sponsorship. This is going to get quite interesting. As the season changed to spring, it was quickly learned that the Chrysler Corporation's altered wheelbase cars had a definitive advantage on the drag strip in the way of traction. Right from the get-go, the people at Ford and Lincoln Mercury made up their minds, and they were adamant about it. Word came down from the management that no one driving one of their cars could make changes to the engine and especially alter the wheelbase on any of their cars. Further instructions made racing the Comet even harder. Orders came down from above that Comet drivers were not to race against any of the altered wheelbase Mopars. This further shackled Arnie's hands to the point of desperation. Step by step, his livelihood was being taken away because the majority of his competitors drove Mopars. And one might expect, most of those were the altered wheelbase A990 lightweights. It's interesting to note that Ford had the big engine to do the battle with anything that Plymouth and Chrysler cars could put together. But even with all the Ford Hemi's muscle, it wasn't enough to overcome the traction advantage. The reason for the mandate of not racing against the altered wheelbase cars was spelled out to Arnie in no uncertain terms. It was the opinion of Lincoln, Mercury, and Ford that the Chrysler Corporation's altered wheelbase cars should be outlawed. This was the way that Ford thought it could impose its will on the racing world and the sanctioning bodies. However, track owners and race promoters couldn't get enough of the new lightweight Mopars. It was more about brand wars of these factory cars. Consequently, as the 1965 racing season went on, track owners and promoters were calling Arnie but telling him to leave the Comet at home and bring the GTO. Any competitive GM race cars in 1965 were scarce, as Arnie only had a handful of other drivers had stuck with anything from the corporation. Arnie was under contract, and he wasn't supposed to drive the Pontiac if the Comet was working. His way around that was to show up with both cars and have Don Gay do the driving for him in the GTO. At least that's what was reported in a few articles where both cars were present. I'm sure it was true for the bigger nationally reported ones, but for the smaller events, only Arnie will ever know for sure who was actually driving. I'm sure that Fran Hernandez might have been a little suspicious. He must have known from reports that was really going on, especially after the story written about the April 18th happenings. York US 30 track in Pennsylvania was the stage where it was reported that Arnie drove the Pontiac in the second round to put down the Sox and Martin's altered wheelbase Plymouth. The end was near. Drag World broke the story first about the end of the Comet for Arnie. The headline in May 21 edition read, "Beswick Merc Split," while the story that the Comet had been picked up from the Beswick farm on May 15th, according to Arnie, no such thing happened. However, what did happen was just as dramatic. While Arnie most likely received the call that they'd pick up the car, Hernandez still didn't have a replacement driver. The article said that Paul Rossi had been commissioned to go out and get the car. As Arnie remembered, he brought the car to Rossi, towing it into race at Martin, Michigan. Nobody from Lincoln Mercury was there in an unceremonious transfer till mid to late June. Arnie expressed his deep regrets in the article, which he repeated 35 years later, about giving up the car. As he stated in the original article, I just couldn't do the car justice while racing the GTO. And with only 50% effort, I would never equal Nicholson, so that was my choice. The Drag World article then mentioned that there was some conjecture as to who was driving the Pontiac during the past few weeks of record-breaking performances. It went to say Don Gay of Dickinson, Texas, friend of Beswick's, was supposed to handle the car, but then said, but seldom did, aka Arnie was driving. The last ironic line from that article about driving the Mystery Tornado read, Farmer says his appearance is scheduled through the rest of the season. So there you have it, guys. That's the story from Arnie and Dean on Arnie driving for Mercury. I know that sounds weird, and if you listen in that article, it kind of sounds like Arnie had his hands tied and really couldn't do the creative things that he really wanted. And if we know Arnie, all the cars he had a hand and built those cars the way he wanted them, and his creativity wasn't topped by anybody else. He took those Pontiacs, made them altered, many different ways, many different configurations with engine, transmission, blowers, injectors, different fuels. The guy was extremely creative. He knew how to work with what he had. And as you can see in that article, well, he just couldn't quite do that with Mercury. But that's the story behind Arnie Beswick and the Mercury AFX Comet. While it could have been a much cooler story if he stuck with the car, who knows what could have happened, I'm just going to say it's actually much cooler that he went back to his Pontiacs. So yeah, I have the original press kit, which is pretty neat, and at the end of the video, you'll get to see page by page of that. But another thing, and I'm not going to touch on it quite yet, while we know Arnie for his Pontiacs, well, guess what? Now you know about his Mercurys. But did you know he actually ended his career in a Hemi Challenger? That's for another time.